What's the difference in matting versus backgrounding? Today we're going to answer that question. That's coming up. Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Reitz. This is Weaver Leather Supply. Today we're going to be talking about the difference between matting the background and backgrounding the background. Now there's a lot of leather artists, a lot of leather craftsmen out there that would consider these two to be essentially interchangeable. To me, they do two very distinct things. They create different effects, and so we have to look at them differently and use them differently. And today we're going to take a look at those so that you can get the most depth and the most texture out of your projects. Now, any of the tools, the leather that we use today, all of it can be found on Weaver Leather Supply. We'll put a link in the description to all of it so that you can go right straight to it. But with that being said, let's go ahead and jump in. So as you can see, I've divided the leather up into different sections. The one that looks kind of weird with the lines running through it, that's supposed to represent vines. We'll come back to that in just a second. But for now, we're going to go ahead and start with the pebble backgrounder. And there's a couple of keys to using this or any of the different backgrounders out there. Number one, you want to start with the largest one that will fit in the area that you're working in. That way you can cover as much ground as possible. The other key is that we want to rotate the tool so that we don't create patterns. Obviously, these tools have a very distinct pattern, and if we just walk it like we would, say, a beveler, then what you're going to get is a repeating pattern. So the way that we avoid that is that we rotate the tool back and forth as we walk it across there, and that prevents those patterns from developing. So the third tip I would give you is don't try to make a large backgrounder fit into an area that it's not designed to fit into. You want to drop down to the next smallest and then the next smallest until you get all the different areas covered. One thing you want to keep in mind is the smaller the stamp, the less pressure it takes, the lighter of a stripe you need to create an impression. If you hit the smallest of the stamps with the same force that you hit the largest of the stamps, it's going to put a really deep impression in there. So you want to vary the amount of pressure that you're striking the stamp with so that you create the same texture all the way through. So what we're doing with the pebbled backgrounder right now, and in fact the one that we're going to use next, this is backgrounding. This is not matting, although you probably could use this tool for that. The difference in matting and backgrounding. Matting is where we're compressing the leather and trying to create additional depth in the design. Backgrounding is where we're adding texture to the background so that we're separating what's behind it versus what's supposed to be in the forefront. And the pebbled texture that we're looking at here and the stony one that we're going to look at next, those are both traditionally going to be backgrounders used to create texture. So one of the things you might notice that I'm doing with the medium size, when I drop down from the large down to the next one, is that I'm rocking that stamp up on its side so that I can snug right up in there against that line. That way I can really put the texture where I want it. With this stamp, the pebbled texture, we want to reserve rocking it up on its side like that for the edges. That way we don't put any strange or uneven marks in the middle of the texture. The next backgrounder that we're going to take a look at is one that I consider to be kind of a stony look. I mean, you could use it for a variety of things. It's really up to your imagination what to use it for. But a lot of times I look at it kind of like creating a stony texture in the background. And just like last time, we're going to start off with the larger of the two stamps. We're going to use it to cover as much ground as possible. One of the things you really want to make sure with this one, because it does have such a distinct pattern on it, is that we want it to sit flat on the leather. If we're in the middle of the area that we're trying to texture and we rock it up on its side, then we're really going to get some strange divots and such in there. Unless you're trying to create that. If you're wanting to create some random depth in there, then that's a great way, rock it up on its side. But if we're trying to create smooth, consistent texture, you want to keep it flat and work as big of an area as you can with the biggest stamp possible. Now let's drop down one size from the largest of the stony backgrounders to the medium-sized one. And one thing I want you to notice here is that the texture pattern is exactly the same. The difference is the larger one is in a more open area where the medium one is compressed into a smaller area. And what that does for you, the larger one gives you a little bit more of a rough texture, whereas the medium one is going to give you more of a consistent stony texture, but it's almost like white noise. There's not as much definition in it, but it is a consistent texture. So that's backgrounding. Now let's jump over to matting. And remember, we said that matting is where we're trying to compress the leather so that it gives us more depth in our design and it makes the design jump to the forefront and the background drops into the background. One of the questions you might ask is, how deep should I mat the background? How much should I compress it? Well, the easiest way to tell if you're at the maximum depth that you can compress the leather, that you should compress the leather, is simply to look at your swivel knife cuts. You want to compress it just as deep as you cut in the design. Now, the way we're going to do this is we're going to start near a corner. We're going to take the matting tool, we're going to drop it in there, and we're gently going to start compressing the leather. The more you get used to it, the more you'll understand how hard you can hit it and such. But we want to start by just going in a nice smooth line, create a smooth texture so that we have a place to start. Once we've got that, we're going to flip our stamp around so that the fat end of the stamp is facing into the corner, and then just work your way in using that leading edge to kind of nibble away at the area that you're trying to compress. Once you get into the corner and it gets too tight for the fat end of the tool, you can flip it around, use the narrow end, and work up in there and finish compressing it. So the key to this is to use the leading edge of your stamp to nibble away at the area that you're trying to compress and mat. The rest of the tool essentially is walking over the area that you've already compressed and smoothing out the texture. It's just like your bevel. When you're going through and you're beveling a line, half of the edge, or the leading edge, is nibbling away and smoothing out that edge. The rest of it, the second half of that bevel, is essentially smoothing it out. There's overlap there, and that's exactly what we're doing with this matting tool. The leading edge nibbles away, the rest of it overlaps and smooths it out. So here's one of the big differences between a backgrounding tool and a matting tool. With a backgrounding tool, we want to rotate that tool so that it's not creating a repeating pattern. With a matting tool, what we want to do is we want to create a consistent, smooth texture. We're not trying to create patterns, we're trying to create a smooth, consistent texture that's compressed. And we're not going to be rotating that tool like we did the backgrounder. So there's two things that you really want to avoid or pay attention to while you're matting the background. The first one is the orientation of the stamp. You want it straight up and down. You don't want it leaning left or right, forward or backward. You usually don't want to rotate it side to side. Those are all going to create inconsistent textures in the background pattern. The other thing that you really need to pay attention to is the moisture content in the leather. If you're too wet or even to the point of being soggy, this is not going to work. It needs to have the correct amount of moisture, or it needs to be leaning towards the dry side. We don't want to lean towards the wet side. There are some situations where we might want it a little wetter. This is not one of them. So when in doubt, let it dry out. So really quick, if you're finding these tips and tricks helpful, do me a favor, let us know by clicking the like button. That tells Weaver, YouTube, and me that we're on the right track. That's going to do it for this video. If you got more questions about how to background and matting and what the difference is and maybe how to solve some problems that you're running into, drop them in the comments section below. I'll do my best to answer them. And if we get enough, maybe I can do a second video and we can answer them for everybody. I'll see you in the next video. And in the meantime, go make something amazing.